everyone, welcome back to another video. My name is Pooja, and if you're returning to the channel, thanks so much for coming back, and if you're new, thanks so much for stopping by. Before we get started with today's video, as always, don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment down below if you have something to say about what I had to say. We're so close to getting 100 subscribers, which is really exciting because that was my goal by June, and it's only April still, and we're so close to it, so thank you so much to everyone who's subscribed so far. So today I am coming at you with part 5 of my Around the World in 80 Books series. For those of you who may not have been following from the beginning, I kind of set a challenge for myself last year to read books from 80 different countries, which I have christened based on Jules Verne's book, Around the World in 80 Days. I'm calling it Around the World in 80 Books. I started this like last summer, so it's almost been a year that I've been doing this, but I'm at part 5, so this is going to be 50 books total, so just got 30 more books left to go, and it's been such a cool journey so far. I feel like I've exposed myself to such interesting writing from all over the world, so I'm really glad that I have done this and stuck with it for so long, so excited to be bringing to you the next installment. So without further ado, let's just jump right on in. So the first book that I have is Homegoing by Yaa Gyasi, who is a Ghanaian-American author, and she actually has a new book out last year called Transcendent Kingdom that I have not read yet, but I'm super excited to do so. This is a very famous book, so I don't feel like I have to go into a ton of detail about it, but for those of you who may not have heard of it before, the essential story follows the family lineages of 2 sisters and kind of goes throughout 7 different generations, so it's really interesting because we get to sort of hear the perspectives of many different characters over the passage of time throughout very significant historical events. So essentially these 2 sisters are from Ghana and they're separated in childhood. One of them goes on to have a family that stays in Ghana and actually becomes very well off. They essentially become royalty in Ghana, close enough to royalty essentially, and kind of follows their story. And then the other sister is actually brought over to the United States as a slave in the transatlantic slave trade, and her family goes on to be a family living throughout slavery in America and then also living as Black Americans and what that experience is like. So it's a really interesting book that brings to light a lot of different issues like racism, like the difference between the experiences of being African versus African American. Just a stunningly written novel that I just could not put down. I read it in sort of one night, and it was just also the writing is just so beautiful that it really captivates you, takes you into the stories of these characters, and really makes you feel for them and feel like you can understand the experiences that they're going through. So I think it's a must-read novel for anyone, honestly, today to truly kind of get an understanding of some of the issues that are explored in here. The second book I'm going to talk about is also very popular, and it is Normal People by Sally Rooney, which is an Irish book. She is an Irish author. Normal People, of course, was adapted into a Hulu series that many people watched, and it became a super popular book. So again, not one that I have to go into a ton of detail, but it follows our main characters, Connell and Marianne, who are sort of in high school together in Ireland, and then sort of follows them as they go to college, and they are sort of an on and off couple, sort of dealing with a lot of these issues that all of us kind of deal with. And so it's a very aptly named book, Normal People, because it's talking about these issues with their interpersonal relationship, how they view their relationship in the context of the broader social circle that they're a part of, sort of how their families bleed into it. Marianne is from a pretty wealthy family, but that one that's not very close, and Connell's mother is quite poor. She's a single mother, but he's very close to her, and so it's a really interesting analysis of all these different issues that come up with characters from 2 different socioeconomic backgrounds who sort of clash, and 2 different social backgrounds. So it's very interesting, but kind of an interesting take on just everyday things that all of us have to deal with. So I really enjoyed it. However, I do feel that Connell is one of my least liked characters in fiction that I've read so far. He just is all of my pet peeves in one person. So I don't like him as a character, but I think the novel itself is really well written and I really enjoyed it. It brought me to tears in several parts. And it's just a really interesting look at things that kind of affect all of us in our everyday lives. And it's nothing like, you know, you can kind of imagine yourself in these characters' shoes really easily. So I really just enjoyed that novel, and I haven't actually watched the Hulu series, but I intend to because I've heard that that is really good as well. The third book is The Glass Hotel by Emily St. John Mandel, who is a Canadian author. And this book, if I had to sort of distill it down into one sentence, essentially follows this like pyramid scheme, Ponzi scheme type of situation. It has a couple of different really interesting characters. One character who's sort of going through rehab and is recovering from a drug addiction, trying to get himself back on his feet again. His sister, who is just a very mysterious character who finds herself in a bunch of really weird situations. And then this wealthier gentleman who turns out to not be as much of a gentleman as you think he is at the beginning. And so, again, just a really interesting sort of mystery novel. The Glass Hotel in question is in this sort of very idyllic setting, and I think in an island off of Vancouver. And it's just beautifully written. I really like how Emily St. John Mandel sort of talks about settings and how that deals with what the characters are going through. So I thought that was sort of a really beautiful aspect of the novel. There were parts of it where I kind of didn't really understand what was going on exactly, but at the end I feel like all the threads kind of tied together, and I found the writing to be really interesting. So I really enjoyed it, but I wouldn't say it's one of my favorite books, but a really good one nonetheless. The next book is Humankind, A Hopeful History by Rutger Bregman, who is a Dutch author from the Netherlands. And so I've actually talked about this book a good bit in one of my wrap-ups. I think maybe it was my December or January wrap-up. And I actually read this book for a work book club. And it's a nonfiction book that really sort of takes this idea of we're fed the narrative a lot that humans are inherently bad and self-interested, and we will inherently make decisions based on our own greed. And that's why all these institutions around us are set up to make us and make our greedy intentions and society's best interests to be aligned so that we can all work together. And we sort of have to be manipulated into working together. And Rutger Bregman kind of takes that narrative and spins it on its head and says, actually, this is sort of a narrative that we've all been fed by the powers that be because it makes it easier to operate a society. But if you actually look at individual stories and real things that have happened throughout humanity's history, people are more inclined to actually help each other and be inherently good and be inherently cooperative. And I just thought that was a really nice message, and so that's why I kind of picked up the book and read it, and why I suggested it to our work book club. But then actually the evidence that he puts forth about why many of these sort of seminal psychological experiments that tell us people are bad, like the Stanford Prison Experiment, etc., have actually been spun in the media sort of in a way that isn't quite truthful. They weren't really well set up experiments, but we sort of laud them as the truth. And then if you look at different stories throughout history in just real life, the same thing kind of becomes self-evident. And so I found that to be a really wonderful message, and one that I really liked that there was evidence for. And it sort of made me feel like I think the book was intending to, more hopeful about humanity and our ability to actually solve problems together and work together and not just feel very doomsday about everything. Okay, I just adjusted positions because my leg about fell asleep. So the next book is The Love and Lies of Rukhsana Ali by Sabina Khan, who is a Bangladeshi-American author. So this book is actually just a fun YA type of novel that I had gotten a lot of recommendations for, so I picked up to sort of read between a bunch of much heavier novels. And then it actually turned out to be a little bit heavier than I thought it was going to be. I thought it was just going to be really cute and nothing terrible was going to happen, and then some terrible things did happen, and I was like, oh, okay. But essentially the basic premise of the book is it deals with the life of our main character, Rukhsana Ali, who is a high schooler who is also Bangladeshi American, and she is actually lesbian, and that is something that her family is totally against. She's in a relationship with her girlfriend, and her parents find out about it, and there's a lot of drama that ensues after that, in her trying to just sort of be who she is, but her family trying to kind of cling to their cultural roots, and just the conflict that she goes through trying to just, get her family to accept her identity. So really just a wonderfully written book. It's a YA book, so it's not anything, too difficult to read, but there are some really troubling incidents that happen later on in the book that I was a bit unprepared for, but I think they really do the job well in conveying sort of the messages the author is going for. But it's just a really cute book, and a book that really makes you sort of appreciate the bond of family and what it means to really be yourself, and get your family to accept that, and just sort of the love that families have for each other despite having different views about how people should be living their lives. So I thought it was a really beautifully written book, one that really sort of brought to life the Bengali American experience. And so I really liked it. But yeah, that's about it on that one. The next book that I have is A Luminous Republic by Andre Barba, who is from Spain. So I've talked about this book in some previous wrap-ups, so I won't go into too much detail again, but this is sort of a weird, I would say it's a very weird book, but it takes place in sort of an unnamed South American country. And it's sort of a spin on Lord of the Flies, because the city that our main character, who is a sort of lower level government official, has been placed in for his work, has this issue with these kids who just live in the woods, nobody knows where they're from, and they come and keep terrorizing the people in the town, and people are just fed up with it, and they need to try to find a solution for it. It's a really lovely take on this sort of Lord of the Flies type idea, but if you insert adults into the equation and try to insert all these like societal pressures into the equation, and what would sort of have happened and how people would have responded to it. So really interesting take on how institutions can really affect innocence and kind of create narratives where there might not be any. It's a very surrealist type of novel, so I really enjoyed that part of it. Absolutely beautiful writing, and it's pretty short, so it was a pretty easy read that I finished in about a day or two. So really enjoyed this one, would highly recommend. The next book I have to talk about is The Inland Sea by Madeleine Watts. I just talked about this in my previous wrap-up, but this is a book by an Australian author. Madeleine Watts is an Australian author, and this book is actually a really, really good choice if you're looking to read like one Australian novel. I would recommend this one, which kind of happened by accident, but the story kind of follows our main character who works in a 911 operator center, but I think it's 000 in Australia. And it sort of follows her life and just like what she's dealing with on a day-to-day basis, but it juxtaposes it against this sort of broader conflict of climate change and how it's affecting Australia in particular, and also brings in really interesting Australian history about how Australia was settled, the first explorers that came to Australia, and the inland sea that's talked about in the title is actually this myth that the first British explorers in Australia had convinced themselves that because many rivers along the coastline actually run inland. So they had thought that there was some kind of sea or oasis in the middle of Australia that would have all this fertile land and everything. As we now know, Australia is literally just a giant desert, so that never existed, but they kept searching for it for ages because they were convinced that it had to exist. And so it's kind of that you take that narrative and juxtapose it against our fight against climate change today, which is we think there might be some kind of thing that's going to save us all, but at the end of the day, we have to just kind of work together and figure out how to solve this huge crisis that happens. And so I just thought it was a really wonderful way of taking this like personal story and this historical story and juxtaposing both of those against this very real social issue that we're all facing today. And in the process, I felt like I learned a lot about Australia that I didn't already know. So would highly recommend if you're doing this sort of read one book from a different country type of thing. The next book I have to talk about is Three Strong Women by Marie Ndiaye, who is a Senegalese French author. This book is one that I've also talked about in a previous video, which is going to happen in this video because these are all books from random different times that I've brought together. But this book was really nice. I enjoyed it. It wasn't my favorite book, definitely, but I did enjoy it a lot. And it sort of follows three different stories of women living in Senegal and just kind of things that they're dealing with in their lives, typically related to their relationships with men in their lives and how they've kind of been sort of beaten down by those men in many ways, but how they sort of find their own independence and are able to sort of carve their own stories out despite having been placed in situations not due to their fault in any way, where they are sort of given this sort of secondary place in the society that they live in. So I just thought it was a really wonderful, like, feminist type of novel. I enjoyed reading the three stories, but definitely something that I was like, okay, cool, this was good, but I didn't think it was like my favorite book or anything, but I did enjoy it, and so would recommend as an introduction to the stories of different women in Senegal. So I thought that part of it was really, really nicely done, and always love a feminist novel. The next book is Cracking India by Bapsi Sidhwa, which is from Pakistan. And so this is actually a book that takes place during partition era in sort of the border of India and Pakistan. and it follows a Parsi family. And so Parsis are actually a pretty small minority in India and Pakistan today. And when you kind of think about stories of partition, you generally hear about them from the perspectives of either Hindus or Muslims or the British. You never kind of hear about these minorities like South Asian Christians or Parsis or Jews or whoever else. I mean, there's so many other minorities that live in that region, but their stories are never really talked about when it comes to all the violence and horrors of the partition era. So it was really illuminating to hear a story from a Parsi perspective. And I think one really interesting thing that Bapsi Sidhwa does in this book is tell us a story from the perspective of a child. And so our main character, Lenny, is sort of watching partition destroy her town around her, turn her neighbors against each other, and she is so innocent as a child that she simply cannot understand why this is happening. And it really sort of brings to light all of these, violent things that are happening in the world around us. Like, why are they happening? When you distill it down to it, it really is senseless violence in many ways. And this is not just partition, but so many other violent conflicts throughout the world today and throughout history. And so when you hear about them from the perspective of a child without all the sort of political context and everything, it's like, yeah, we should find ways to resolve tensions peacefully, because at the end of the day, we're all each other's neighbors. So I thought that was just a really nice message. And this was a really heart-wrenching book. And it's hard to read because there are some really difficult passages in it, but a really beautifully done book and a really interesting perspective on partition that I had not really thought about before. And then the last book that I'll be talking about in this video is The Refugees by Viet Nguyen, who is an author from Vietnam. This is a collection of short stories all about people that have somehow been affected by the Vietnam War generally. Either they are refugees from Vietnam now settled in the United States, or there are some characters who actually fought in the war. There are some characters whose families were a part of that war somehow and are now trying to sort of understand the repercussions of it. And it's a beautifully done set of short stories, pretty heavy topics, obviously, because it's dealing with a very traumatic experience for many of these characters, but I think a really nice introduction to Viet Nguyen's writing. I haven't actually read his Pulitzer Prize winning book, The Sympathizer, which is about similar themes, but I've heard that that book is really difficult to read and really emotionally turbulent. So I think reading a collection of short stories is a good way to sort of get a taste of that, but not really immerse yourself in that heavy of a novel if that's not something you're looking for at the moment. And it'll give you kind of an understanding of what to expect, and then I'm actually looking forward to reading The Sympathizer at some point soon. So that's all the books for today in the 5th installment of Around the World in 80 Books, and so that brings us to 50 books, which is pretty exciting, and so hopefully we'll have the 6th one out at some point soon. But I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Let me know if you've read any of the books that I talked about, or if you have any other recommendations for future countries. You can see a link in my bio for all the countries that I've read so far. So if any of the countries that are not crossed off yet, you have a good recommendation for it, please let me know. I'm always looking out for good recommendations. And yeah, so that's all for today. Hope everyone's still staying safe and healthy, and I will catch you in the next video. Until then, bye-bye.